The morning was peaceful, the kind that felt slow and steady, where everything seemed exactly as it should be. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting soft golden patches across the wooden floors. The air carried the comforting scent of fresh coffee and buttered toast. It was a quiet morning in a quiet suburban home, just another ordinary day. In the kitchen, Mary, a 68-year-old grandmother, stood by the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. She hummed softly to herself, an old lullaby she used to sing to her own daughter when she was little. The rhythm was soothing, a familiar comfort. With her free hand, she reached for her coffee cup, taking a slow sip, relishing the warmth as she let out a contented sigh. Across the house, Noah, her 10-month-old grandson, sat on a thick plush rug in the middle of the living room. His round cheeks dimpled as he babbled happily to himself, his tiny fingers wandering over the toys scattered around him. His world was small, but it was full of wonder. He had just begun crawling, and every object within reach became a new adventure. His favorite stuffed bear, a few colorful blocks, and a plastic teething ring sat around him. But none of them held his attention for long. He was always searching for something new, something different. He reached out, his chubby fingers brushing against the fibers of the rug, feeling the textures beneath his hands. A few feet away, stretched out near the couch, lay Buddy, the family's 6-year-old pitbull. He was large, muscular, and imposing to anyone who didn't know him, but to Noah he was just Buddy, the gentle giant, the warm protector, the ever-present shadow keeping watch over him. Buddy had always been protective, but there was something about Noah that had made his instincts even sharper. He had been there when the baby first came home from the hospital, sniffing him cautiously, then quickly claiming him as his own. Since then, he had rarely strayed far. Even in sleep, his ears twitched at every little noise Noah made. This morning, Buddy lay comfortably, his head resting on his front paws, eyes half-lidded in the golden light. Everything was calm. Everything was safe, or so it seemed. As Noah's tiny hand moved across the rug, something unexpected caught his attention. His fingers brushed against a small, cool object. Curious, he closed his hand around it, gripping it tightly before lifting it up to inspect. It was a bottle cap, a tiny, seemingly insignificant thing left over from the night before. No one had noticed it. It had been small enough to slip past a cleaning cloth hidden in the fibers of the rug. Noah's fingers turned the cap over, fascinated by its smooth, hard surface. It was different from his soft plush toys, different from the rubbery texture of his teething ring. He turned it in his palm, testing its weight, and then, without hesitation, he brought it to his mouth. Across the room, Buddy's ears twitched. Something was off. He lifted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes narrowing. His tail, which had been lazily wagging in his relaxed state, suddenly stopped moving. His body, once loose and sprawled out, began to tense. Something wasn't right. Noah, still unaware of the shift in the room, continued to mouth the object, his tiny lips closing around it. It was small enough to fit between his gums, but the ridges made it feel strange on his tongue. He gurgled slightly, adjusting the way it sat in his mouth. Buddy inhaled deeply, his large chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled motion. His instincts, those ancient, primal warnings that had kept his kind alive for centuries, began to sound an alarm. His head lifted higher, his muscles tightened, his breath became shorter, sharper. Something wasn't right. From the kitchen, Mary was oblivious. She gave the oatmeal another slow stir, then turned to check on the coffee pot. The clinking of her spoon against the pot, the soft shuffle of her slippers on the tiled floor. These were the only sounds she paid attention to. She didn't see Buddy push himself up onto his feet. She didn't see the way his stance changed, his body shifting from relaxed to rigid. She didn't see the way his eyes locked onto Noah, unblinking, filled with something bordering on urgency. The baby let out a soft, muffled noise, a small, almost insignificant sound. A cough, barely noticeable. Buddy noticed. His large paws moved forward in slow, deliberate steps. He was careful, calculated, not too fast, not too sudden. But his body was tense, his every muscle coiled like a spring, ready to act. Noah shifted slightly, his tiny fingers still gripping the bottle cap. His mouth moved as if testing the object, pressing it lightly against his gums. Buddy let out a soft, uneasy whine. It wasn't loud, barely more than a breath of sound, but it carried weight. Something was wrong. He took another step forward, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor as he moved in closer. Noah's face twitched, his little brows furrowing. His chubby hands wobbled slightly as if unsure of what to do next. He made another small sound, something halfway between a hiccup and a cough. Buddy froze. His ears went flat against his skull, his tail dropped slightly, not in fear but in focus. Something was wrong. From the kitchen, Mary remained blissfully unaware. She turned off the burner, giving the oatmeal one final stir before wiping her hands on a dish towel. She took another sip of coffee, savoring the warmth as she turned toward the living room, ready to check on Noah. But before she even stepped forward, Buddy moved first. His instincts screamed, his heart pounded, his body launched forward. It was no longer just an observation. It was an intervention, and everything that happened next would determine whether this morning remained an ordinary day or became one that changed everything. Buddy's body tensed. His instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. The room had been peaceful just moments ago. Warm morning light streaming through the windows, the gentle hum of Mary in the kitchen, the soft babbling of baby Noah playing on the rug. But now, that peace had shattered. Noah had stopped babbling. Buddy's sharp eyes locked onto the baby. His ears twitched, his nostrils flared. Something had changed. Noah's small hands were no longer reaching for his toys. Instead, they had moved toward his throat. His fingers curled slightly, his tiny body stiffened. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. Buddy's muscles coiled. His breath quickened. A low, uneasy whine rumbled from deep in his chest. Noah's face was turning red. Buddy lunged forward. His powerful frame moved in an instant, his large paws barely making a sound as he rushed toward the baby. His broad head nudged Noah's chest, pushing at him, testing for a response. Noah's hands gripped at his own throat, his lips trembled. His eyes, wide and confused, darted around. His small body tensed as if trying to fight against something unseen. Buddy whined louder. He pressed his nose against Noah's cheek, nudging, pushing, trying to make him react. Nothing. The baby wasn't crying. He wasn't coughing. He wasn't making any sound at all. A bolt of panic shot through Buddy. He turned sharply and bolted toward the kitchen. He ran faster than he ever had, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor, his powerful legs propelling him toward the only person who could help. He reached Mary in seconds and shoved his nose into her leg hard. Mary, still stirring the pot of oatmeal, stumbled slightly at the unexpected nudge. "Buddy," she scolded, looking down at him in surprise. "What has gotten into you?" Buddy let out a desperate whine and pushed her again, his wide brown eyes full of urgency. Mary frowned. "Not now, Buddy," she said, shaking her head. She reached for a towel, wiping her hands. Buddy's frustration grew. She didn't understand. She didn't see what was happening. He barked, a sharp, urgent sound. Mary sighed. "Enough, boy. Go lie down." She turned back to the stove. Buddy growled softly in frustration. She wasn't listening, but he wasn't giving up. He turned, his muscles bunching beneath his sleek coat as he sprinted back toward the living room. His heart pounded. His instincts screamed. He needed to act. And so, he did the first thing that came to mind. He jumped onto the coffee table. His powerful front paws hit the surface with force, and the impact sent a glass of water crashing onto the floor. The sharp sound shattered the quiet. Mary whipped around, startled. She took a sharp breath, eyes narrowing as she saw the spilled water, the broken glass. "Buddy!" she snapped. "What are you—" But Buddy wasn't looking at her. He was staring at something behind her. Mary's heart skipped a beat. A strange, cold feeling crept over her. Slowly, she followed Buddy's gaze. And then, she saw him. Noah. He was sitting on the rug just as he had been before, but his little hands were now clutched tightly at his throat. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. His tiny face was no longer just red. It was turning blue. The world around Mary seemed to tilt. For a brief moment, everything else, the scent of oatmeal, the sunlight streaming in through the window, the sound of the ticking clock, faded into nothing. All she could see was Noah, her grandson, struggling to breathe. The room fell into silence, a silence that was deafening, a silence that told her everything was wrong. Her body locked up, her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. Noah's arms trembled as he clutched at his throat, his tiny body straining, his lips parting in a desperate attempt to breathe. But there was nothing. No cry, no sound, no air. Time seemed to slow. Mary's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. A sickening wave of fear washed over her. Then, in an instant, the paralysis broke. She moved. Her entire body jolted into action as the weight of what she was seeing crashed down on her. She took one staggering step forward. Buddy was already there. His body pressed against her legs, his deep brown eyes locked onto Noah's face. His tail, usually wagging, was still. His entire frame was tense, ready. He knew. He had known before she did. Mary's breath came in short, frantic gasps as the reality of the moment slammed into her. Noah was choking, and she only had seconds to act. The oatmeal on the stove boiled over, spilling onto the burner with a loud hiss. A bird chirped outside. The world continued as if nothing was wrong. But inside this house, inside this moment, everything had changed. Mary's hands shook violently. She could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. She opened her mouth to say something, to cry out, to scream for help, but no words came. All she could do was stare at her grandson, frozen in terror. Then, Buddy whined softly. The sound broke through her haze of fear like a crack in a frozen lake. She turned her head, eyes meeting the dog's. Buddy's gaze was steady, focused, urging her to move. And in that split second, Mary knew what she had to do. She took a breath. She reached for Noah, and she prepared to act. Mary's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her chest tightening as if the air in the room had vanished. Her body felt stiff, frozen in a moment of terror so overwhelming that she thought her heart might stop. Noah was choking. The baby who had just been laughing and babbling was now silent. His little fingers clutched at his throat, his lips parted in a desperate attempt to breathe, but no sound came out. His round cheeks, once rosy with life, were turning a deep, unnatural shade of red. Mary's entire world shrank to the small, struggling child in her arms. She lunged forward, dropping to her knees as she scooped Noah up, clutching his tiny body against her chest. Her hands, frail with age, shook violently as she touched his face, his soft curls damp against her trembling fingers. "Noah!" Her voice was raw, breaking with fear. Oh God, baby, can you hear me? Breathe, sweetheart, please breathe!" Her mind spiraled, grasping at any possible explanation, any solution. But she had no answers. She was a grandmother, not a doctor. She knew how to soothe him when he cried. She knew how to rock him to sleep. She knew how to wipe away his tiny tears when he was scared. But she didn't know how to bring him back from this. Terror paralyzed her. Her arms tightened around him as if holding him close could somehow fix it. His body was too still, too limp, his tiny fingers weakly pawing at his throat as though he was losing the fight. A whimper broke the silence beside her. Buddy. The big pit bull wasn't just watching anymore. He jumped up, planting his heavy paws against Mary's lap, pressing into her like an anchor. His whine turned to an urgent bark, then another. His deep brown eyes were locked onto Noah, filled with the same desperation that was threatening to drown Mary. He knew. He had known before she did, and he was begging her to act. But Mary's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her thoughts were a blur. What was she supposed to do? What if she did something wrong? What if she hurt him instead of helping? What if— Another bark. Mary gasped, the sound snapping her out of her panic. Her mind fought through the fog of fear, searching, reaching. And then she remembered. A CPR class. Years ago, when Noah was first born, Chloe had made her take one. "Just in case, Mom," her daughter had said. Mary had nodded, had promised to remember, but she had never truly believed she would need it. Now it was the only thing that mattered. Her arms moved with instinct. She shifted Noah, cradling him in her lap, turning him face down. Her hands trembled as she positioned his tiny body across her forearm, angling him slightly downward. Her own breath was shallow, ragged. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "Come on, Noah. Stay with me." Her palm hovered over his back. Her mind screamed at her. What if she wasn't doing this right? What if she was making it worse? Another bark. Buddy's voice rang through the room, sharp, commanding. Mary didn't hesitate anymore. She struck Noah's back. One firm blow between his tiny shoulder blades. Nothing. Her stomach dropped. She hit again, harder. Still nothing. Tears blurred Mary's vision. Her hands felt weak, helpless. Noah was still so frighteningly still. Another strike. Her breath hitched. Noah's tiny body gave a weak, almost imperceptible jerk, but there was still no sound. The silence was unbearable. A heavy weight pressed against her leg. Buddy. His warm body leaned against her, grounding her, reminding her that she couldn't stop. She raised her hand again. Hit. Harder. Noah's limp frame shifted slightly, but he was still silent. Buddy let out a low, agonizing growl. Mary flinched. She had never heard him make a sound like that before. Not when he was scared, not when he was hurt. This was something deeper. This was grief. A sound of pure, unfiltered despair, and it was the most terrifying thing Mary had ever heard, because Buddy understood something she couldn't accept. They were losing him. Noah was slipping away. A sob ripped from Mary's throat. Her fingers dug into Noah's small back as she hit again. She prayed. She begged. "Come on, baby," she whispered through her tears. "Come back to Grandma." She raised her hand. One last time. This had to work. It had to. She brought her palm down, her frail body shaking with effort. And then, nothing. No sound. No relief. No response. Noah's body was too still. Mary stared at him, her vision swimming with tears. Her body felt like it was collapsing in on itself. The room spun. Her heart screamed. She didn't realize she was shaking her head, didn't realize she was rocking him in her arms, didn't realize she was whispering his name over and over again, because she couldn't believe what was happening. She had prayed for a miracle, but miracles didn't always come. Her gaze dropped to Noah's tiny face. His lips were still parted. His fingers had gone limp. His beautiful, perfect cheeks were no longer pink. A strangled, breathless cry tore from Mary's throat. Her entire body felt like it was breaking. Number. She couldn't lose him. She had to do something else. Something. Anything. Her fingers curled around Noah's small shoulders. She lifted him up, repositioning him, preparing for something, anything, that could save him. Buddy let out another agonizing whimper. Tears blurred Mary's vision. Her own breath came in frantic, desperate gasps. And for the first time, she wondered if she had already lost him. Had she been too late? Had Noah already slipped too far away? The thought shattered her. And then, for a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no life. Mary's entire world hung in the balance, teetering between hope and despair. She clutched Noah's tiny body, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst. Her frail fingers trembled as she stared at his unmoving face, searching for any sign, any flicker of breath, any twitch of his lips that would tell her he was still here. Nothing came. A strangled sob caught in her throat. The weight of helplessness pressed down on her chest, like a crushing stone. This couldn't be it. It couldn't end like this. Her body shook violently, not just from fear, but from the unbearable thought that she might have already lost him. She couldn't lose him, not like this, not while she still had the strength to fight. With a final burst of desperation, Mary lifted her trembling hand, her last strike fueled by sheer determination. She brought her palm down hard, striking between Noah's shoulder blades with every ounce of strength her aging body could muster. A sharp, hollow bop echoed through the air, and then something happened. A soft, wet sound, a small, barely perceptible movement. Mary's breath caught. She barely had time to react before a small plastic object shot out of Noah's mouth, landing on the wooden floor with a faint clatter. Time froze for the briefest of seconds, and then a gasp. A tiny, desperate, beautiful gulp of air. Noah sucked in a breath so deep, so ragged, that it rattled through his little chest. His whole body tensed as his lungs filled with life again, and then he wailed, a loud, piercing, heart-wrenchingly beautiful cry. Mary collapsed forward, sobbing. Her whole body convulsed with relief as she wrapped her arms around Noah, clutching him as if she could physically hold him to this world, refusing to ever let go. She rocked him, her tears falling onto his soft curls, her breath coming in shuddering waves. "Oh, God. Oh, my God. Noah. Baby. My sweet baby," she choked out between sobs. She pulled back slightly, pressing kisses onto his damp forehead, his warm cheeks, his tiny hands. "Oh, my baby. My baby. You're breathing. You're breathing." Her voice broke on the last word. Noah's tiny body trembled against her, his cries strong and steady, his small fists clenching the fabric of her blouse as if he, too, was holding on to her for dear life. Mary wept freely. She didn't care about the tears. She didn't care about the way her body trembled uncontrollably, or the way her heart ached from sheer relief. All that mattered was the sound of Noah's cries filling the house. The silence that had threatened to consume him was gone. The awful, terrible quiet had been replaced with the most beautiful noise she had ever heard. Behind her, a sudden thump on the floor snapped her out of her overwhelming relief. Buddy. The big pitbull had dropped to all fours, his whole body tense with anticipation. His ears were perked, his head tilted slightly, his deep brown eyes locked onto Noah. Then his tail wagged, not just a small wag. A full, wild, joyous wag. Buddy let out an excited bark, a sharp burst of happiness that shattered the tension in the room. And then, before Mary could react, he jumped up onto the couch, pressing his massive head against Noah's tiny face, licking his cheeks, his nose, his forehead, anywhere he could reach. Mary let out a breathless, tearful laugh, watching as Buddy lavished Noah with kisses. The dog's whole body wiggled with excitement, his tail wagging so furiously that it knocked into the side table, sending a lamp shaking. But Buddy didn't care. He had saved his boy. And now he had to make sure his boy was okay. Noah, still hiccuping from his cries, blinked up at the big dog through watery eyes. His small hands reached out, his tiny fingers brushing against Buddy's soft fur. Buddy immediately stilled. He froze in place, watching as Noah's little hand clumsily gripped his ear, tugging ever so slightly. A quiet whimper escaped the pit bull's throat, a sound of pure, unfiltered emotion. Then, his tail wagged even harder. Mary watched, overwhelmed, as Buddy pressed his forehead against Noah's tiny chest, resting there for just a moment, as if listening to his heartbeat, as if he needed to hear it, as if he needed reassurance that Noah was truly alive. Mary reached out, her fingers tangling into Buddy's fur. She pulled him close, pressing her forehead against his massive head. "You knew," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You knew before I did." Buddy didn't move. He just stayed there, letting Mary hold on to him, letting her sob into his fur, letting Noah clutch at his ears, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling in a soft rhythm. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, everything was okay. Mary let out a deep, shuddering breath. She sat back slightly, adjusting Noah in her arms, pressing one last kiss against his forehead. He was still crying, but it was different now. It wasn't a sound of fear. It was the sound of a child coming back to life, and it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Buddy let out another soft, happy bark, nudging Noah's hand with his wet nose. Noah hiccuped, then let out a tiny, almost curious giggle between sobs. Mary laughed too, a shaky, tearful, relieved laugh. She reached down, running her fingers over the small plastic bottle cap that had nearly stolen her grandson's life. Such a tiny thing. So small, so insignificant. And yet, it had nearly taken everything. Her fingers curled into a fist around it, gripping it tightly. Then, without hesitation, she flung it across the room, sending it bouncing against the far wall before it disappeared under the couch. Gone. Forgotten. It would never threaten her grandson again. Mary exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a moment. Then she looked down at Noah, at his tiny face still pressed against her chest, his breathing finally steady. She looked at Buddy, at the dog who had saved them both, and she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Buddy." Buddy just wagged his tail, his big brown eyes full of warmth. And as Mary held Noah close, letting the weight of relief wash over her, she knew one thing for certain. They would never take another breath for granted again. Mary's hands still trembled as she clutched Noah close to her chest, his warm body nestled safely against her. The baby's breathing was slow, steady now, though his tiny hiccups and occasional sobs reminded her of just how close they had come to losing him. The house was eerily quiet except for the soft sniffles escaping from Mary's lips, the occasional rustling of Noah's tiny hands against her blouse, and Buddy's deep, steady breaths as he lay beside them, still watchful. Mary exhaled shakily, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, exhaustion, gratitude, but also something else. A deep, lingering sense of realization. Noah had almost died, and Chloe had no idea. A cold shiver ran through Mary's spine as the full weight of that thought settled on her chest. Her daughter, Noah's mother, had no idea that while she was off at work, her son had been fighting for his life. Mary's grip on her grandson tightened. She had to tell her. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone. It felt heavier than usual, or maybe her hands were simply too weak from the emotional storm that had just passed. Her breath came unevenly as she swiped to find Chloe's number. She hesitated. How could she even say it? How could she put into words the terror she had just lived through? But she had no choice. She pressed call. It rang once, twice. Then, on the third ring, "Mom?" Chloe's voice came through, slightly distracted, tinged with the distant noise of an office in the background. Mary tried to speak, but for a moment her throat closed up. Her grip on the phone tightened. Then, barely above a whisper, "Chloe, Noah Suchet." A sharp inhale crackled through the receiver. "What?" Mary swallowed, trying to steady herself, but the words tumbled out in a desperate rush. He was choking. He wasn't breathing, Chloe. He turned blue. I thought I was going to lose him. Her voice broke. I would have, if it weren't for Buddy. He saved Noah's life. Silence. Then, a sharp, muffled sob. No, Chloe's voice trembled. No, 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 that can't be. I swear to you, baby, Mary whispered. It was Buddy. He knew. He tried to tell me, and I almost didn't listen, but he wouldn't stop. He saved Noah. On the other end of the line, Mary could hear the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. A rustling. Footsteps. Then, a door slamming shut. Chloe was already leaving. I'm coming home. Her voice was barely above a breath, but it carried a weight of urgency Mary had never heard before. Then the line went dead. Mary exhaled, closing her eyes. She could picture Chloe now, her daughter running through the office halls, pushing past confused colleagues, fumbling for her car keys with trembling hands. She had spent years watching Chloe chase after success, always rushing from one meeting to the next, always prioritizing deadlines over dinner time. But today, nothing else mattered. Not work, not emails, not the meetings she had likely spent days preparing for. Only Noah. Chloe's hands were shaking as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Noah, her baby. She could barely see the road through the blur of tears clouding her vision. How could this have happened? How could she not have been there? How close had she come to losing him? The thought was too much to bear. She pressed harder on the accelerator, forcing herself to focus, to breathe. In her mind, she kept replaying Mary's words. He wasn't breathing. I thought I was going to lose him. Buddy saved him. She had always trusted Buddy, but she had never realized just how much she had taken him for granted. Just like she had taken for granted the idea that her son would always be safe, that he would always be waiting for her at the end of the day, happy and smiling, that she would always have more time. Her breath hitched. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. The moment Chloe pulled into the driveway, she didn't even bother shutting off the engine completely. She flung the car door open, nearly tripping as she sprinted toward the house. Her hands fumbled with the keys. But before she could even use them, the front door was already open. Mary stood in the doorway, tears still glistening on her cheeks. But in her arms, Noah, alive, breathing. His little eyes, puffy from crying, widened at the sight of her. Chloe let out a broken sob as she rushed forward, gathering her baby into her arms, holding him as tightly as she could. Her whole body shook. Her fingers curled protectively around his tiny frame, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, memorizing every breath. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed frantic kisses against his soft curls. My baby. My sweet, sweet baby, she whispered, her voice raw. Mommy's here. I'm here. Noah gurgled, blinking up at her, his small fingers reaching to grasp a strand of her hair. Her heart shattered into a million pieces. She rocked him, her own breaths ragged, soaking in every second, every heartbeat, every tiny movement. Then she turned to Mary, and her face crumpled. Oh, God, Mom, she whispered, voice thick with guilt. If you and Buddy weren't here, if I had lost him... She couldn't even finish the sentence. She shook her head, tears spilling onto Noah's tiny shoulder. Then, voice breaking, I'm so sorry, Mom. Mary placed a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. Chloe's face was crumpled with remorse, exhaustion, and something deeper, realization. Her mother's voice was quiet but firm. Honey, you still have time to fix this. Chloe blinked up at her, her whole body trembling. Don't ever let your work be more important than your family, Mary whispered. The words hit her like a tidal wave. Chloe's breath came in a shaky exhale. She looked down at Noah, at his sleepy, peaceful face against her chest, then back at Buddy, who was watching her with his steady, knowing gaze. Then, finally, she nodded. And as she pulled Noah closer, she made a silent promise to never let him slip away again. The house was quiet again, not the suffocating, dreadful silence from earlier that day, but a peaceful stillness, the kind that settled in after a storm had passed. Noah was safe. Chloe watched as he lay nestled in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, his round cheeks still flushed from the tears he had shed hours before. His little hand curled slightly into a loose fist, resting near his face, his lashes fluttering ever so slightly as he drifted deeper into sleep. Her heart clenched at the sight. She had almost lost him. The thought still sent a cold shiver through her spine, but she quickly pushed it away. Tonight wasn't about fear. Tonight was about gratitude. With careful fingers, Chloe reached down and gently smoothed his soft, wispy hair. She traced her fingertips along his forehead, down the bridge of his tiny nose, committing every detail of his face to memory, as if she needed to reassure herself that he was truly here. She inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle into her bones. A quiet rustle from the floor caught her attention. There, lying beside the crib, was Buddy. His large frame was stretched out, his head resting on his paws, but his deep brown eyes were still open, watchful, steady, and filled with something Chloe could only describe as love. She didn't know why she had never noticed it before. How he was always there, how he never truly slept when Noah was in the room, how he had always been more than just a dog. Her breath trembled as she slowly lowered herself onto her knees beside him. For a moment, she just looked at him, looked at the dog who had saved her son's life. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, she wrapped her arms around him. She buried her face in his thick fur, her shoulders trembling as the emotions of the day came rushing back all at once. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse, thick with emotion. The pit bull stayed completely still, as if he understood, as if he was giving her a moment to let it all out. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, holding on to him tighter. "You saved my son," her voice cracked. You saved him, Buddy." Her breath hitched as fresh tears burned her eyes. She hadn't been there. She had been sitting in an office, staring at a computer screen, caught up in deadlines and phone calls, while her son had been fighting for his life. But Buddy had been there. Buddy hadn't looked away. Buddy had refused to give up. She pulled back slightly, running her hands along his broad shoulders, her fingers trembling against his warm fur. You're an angel, Buddy," she whispered. The dog's ears perked up slightly at the sound of her voice. Then, slowly, gently, he lifted his head and licked her hand. It was so simple, so small, yet it broke something deep inside her. A quiet sob escaped her lips as she let her forehead rest against his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Buddy let out a low, satisfied sigh, as if telling her he already knew, as if telling her she didn't need to thank him, because this was what he was meant to do, because he had always been Noah's guardian. Chloe closed her eyes, breathing him in, feeling his warmth, his steady presence. She had spent so many years thinking of Buddy as just the family dog. But tonight, she understood. He was so much more. A protector, a friend, a savior. A part of their family in a way she had never truly acknowledged before. She had almost lost sight of what mattered most, and it had taken a pit bull with a heart bigger than his body to remind her. She smiled through her tears, running her fingers through his fur one last time before leaning back. Buddy wagged his tail softly, his job done. Across the room, Mary sat in her old rocking chair, watching them with a quiet, knowing smile. She had seen it all. She had watched Chloe rush through life, always moving too fast, always chasing the next thing. And she had always feared that one day, Chloe would wake up and realize she had missed the most important moments. But tonight, she knew. Chloe had finally seen it, finally understood. Mary let her gaze drift between her daughter, her grandson, and the dog who had saved them all. Her heart swelled with something deep, something warm. Love. Pure, unshakable love. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the day melt away. She had almost lost so much today. But tonight, as she watched Chloe kneeling beside Buddy, saw the way Noah slept peacefully in his crib, felt the warmth of family surrounding her, she knew she had been given a second chance. And second chances were not to be wasted. Chloe looked up, meeting her mother's eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Everything had already been said. Everything had already been understood. Chloe's lips trembled, but her eyes were steady. "I almost lost everything today," she whispered. Mary nodded. "But you didn't." Chloe swallowed hard. "Because of you," she said softly, "and because of Buddy." Mary smiled, reaching out to rest a gentle hand on her daughter's arm. "And now, you have a chance to make sure you never take any of it for granted again." Chloe inhaled shakily, then nodded. Tonight was a turning point, a reminder of what truly mattered, and she would never forget it again. The house was silent, but this time it was the kind of silence that felt safe, the kind that wrapped around them like a warm embrace, the kind that promised peace. Buddy curled up beside Noah's crib, his tail twitching slightly as he finally allowed himself to relax. Chloe reached out, brushing her fingers against Noah's hand one last time before stepping back. Her heart felt lighter. Her purpose felt clearer. She turned toward Mary, offering a soft, grateful smile. Then together, they turned off the lights. And as the moonlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow over the room, the family, whole, safe, and complete, drifted into sleep, knowing, without a shadow of a doubt, that love would always be the most important thing. At its core, this heartwarming story is a testament to the unbreakable bond between humans and their canine companions. It is more than just one of those touching dog stories that make us feel warm inside. It is a powerful reminder of the depth of love, loyalty, and intuition that animals bring into our lives. Dogs have an extraordinary ability to sense danger, to protect, and to love without conditions. In moments of crisis, they often rise beyond what we expect of them, acting not just as pets, but as true rescue dogs, guardians of the families they cherish. This story beautifully illustrates that a dog's devotion goes beyond companionship. It is instinctual, unwavering, and at times, life-saving. But beyond the heroism of an animal, this story speaks to something even deeper: the importance of presence, of cherishing the moments that truly matter. In the rush of daily life, it is easy to get caught up in responsibilities, career aspirations, and endless distractions. But in the end, what truly holds value are the people and the loyal companions who are always by our side, waiting for us to notice them, to appreciate them, to recognize the quiet yet profound ways they show love. The lessons embedded in this story resonate universally. It reminds us that family should always come first, that love should never be taken for granted, and that sometimes the greatest heroes in our lives walk on 4 legs. It sheds light on the silent sacrifices made by those who care for us, whether they are parents, children, or the devoted dog who never leaves our side. This story also reinforces the idea that every second chance is a gift. We don't always get warnings before life changes in an instant, but when we do, we must embrace them wholeheartedly. It teaches us that while we may not always be perfect, we can always choose to do better, to be more present, to love deeper, and to hold on to what truly matters. And perhaps most beautifully, it is a tribute to the quiet heroes among us, the dogs who wait patiently, who protect us without hesitation, and who ask for nothing in return but our love. It is a reminder that sometimes a rescue dog is not just a dog we save. Sometimes they are the ones who save us. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.